Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this third part of my life experiences, I will discuss the European intellectual history which led to the absurd foundations on which economic theory has been currently built. In the first part of this talk, I explained the conflict between faith and reason. Faith tells us that the wisdom of the Quran should guide us in all domains of knowledge, but the intellectual developments in the West and our education teaches us that Quran is irrelevant today, and all modern knowledge is built on by Western intellectuals. In the second part of this talk, I explained how Edward Said's book on Orientalism showed that an entire field of knowledge was built on the assumptions of European superiority, and that led me to the belief that perhaps economic theory is also a demonstration of it. It is built on completely false foundations. And this current part explains how I arrived at the conclusion that this guess of mine is indeed true. To learn how economics is fundamentally wrong, we have to look at the intellectual history of the West. I myself got my first clue from Bayrock, who showed that economic theories are in direct conflict with historical evidence about economics. And later I realized that the history that we have been taught, which projects the West as the only actor on the world stage and the most superior and advanced civilization, is actually false and fabricated history. When we look at the history of economics, we find that the natural methodology of economics is qualitative and historical. You study the economics of various countries to study how they behave. Modern methodology is quantitative and mathematical, just like physics. Study of history actually provides us with general guidance, just like our life experiences, but doesn't provide any laws or theorems. But the trauma of loss of faith we discussed in earlier portions led European intellectuals to reject this experiential knowledge and to look for universal laws just like those of physics. In a battle of methodologies which took place in the late 19th century, the historical and qualitative traditional approach to economics was replaced by the current quantitative and scientific approach. This has led to absurd foundations for modern economics. The idea that there are universal laws of economic behavior which are valid across time and space is ridiculous. Similarly, the idea that my behavior or human behavior or the behavior of firms can be characterized by simple mathematical laws is ridiculous. Economic theory is built on the idea that the future can be more or less predicted. This is completely ridiculous. The idea that human beings can be subjected to mathematical laws and that they seek to maximize profits, this comes from descriptions of physical behavior of actual particles. Human beings are not that deterministic. Instead of going into a critique, which has been done by many people in many different places, we focus on the idea of how can intelligent people believe in crazy ideas. At my university, we studied models of economic theory which made absolutely no sense. We studied trade between countries which are identical in technology, but this is not true of the trade that we see in the world around us. And similarly, many theories about the world were built on assumptions which simply were absurd. To understand how intelligent people can believe in crazy ideas, we have to look at the history of intellectual developments in the West. First, the Dark Ages came about in Europe because they rejected all sources of knowledge separate from their official church. Later, the Dark Ages ended when the Western civilization encountered the Muslims and managed to conquer Al-Andalus, the declining and civilization of Islamic Spain, and translated millions of books. This led to a battle between the incoming knowledge and the orthodoxy of Catholic Church, which ultimately broke up the church and led to a century of bloody battles and general disenchantment with religion. The trauma of loss of faith created by these centuries of battles between Christians has colored all Western theories of knowledge. The positivist epistemology, which currently dominates, says that knowledge must be built on what we can see and touch, because we cannot rely on our intuition and we cannot rely on our hearts. And this basic idea that we should use our heads and not our hearts is incorporated by Descartes, the father of modern Western philosophy, and I think, therefore I am. He doesn't rely on his experience of living, but on his logic to deduce that he exists. The Quran says about this that it is not their eyes which are blinded, but it is the hearts. And indeed, the Europeans self-inflicted blindness on their own hearts by rejecting the heart as a source of knowledge. In general, the West has a theory of knowledge which rejects all unobservables, and this is in stark contrast to the Quran, which tells us that taqwa means believing in the unseen. This theory led to a fundamental inability to understand how science works, because science works by looking at the appearances to deduce the hidden forces that drive these appearances. Ibn al-Haytham discovered the theory of vision, invisible particles of light which travel in straight lines, by looking at the properties of actual vision. Similarly, Newton deduced the existence of the hidden force of gravity by looking at the behavior of falling bodies. This type of logic was rejected in the theory of philosophy of science because it doesn't lead to certainty, and it can also lead to the deduction that God exists, because we look at the symmetry of the universe and the amazing precision, and we deduce that it must have been created. So there was a sharp division between how science actually works and how philosophers of science understood that science works. Science itself was worked directly by experience, but the philosophers of science set out to prove that science is actually leads to certain results and it is the only valid source of knowledge. This was a big mistake, and this mistake led to the development of the philosophy of science, which dramatically misunderstood the workings of science. Then this misunderstanding was applied to develop the social sciences in the 20th century. So while the philosophy of science did not affect science, it was of tremendous importance in the construction of social sciences, and humanities was converted into a science. And this was not a valid attempt, because the theory of science, which relies on universal laws, cannot be applied to human beings. But this was done, and this is why the foundations of modern social science are hopelessly bad. So we can conclude this talk by saying that the rejection of unobservables created by rejection of faith has led to complete blindness to human motivation and sources of human welfare, and this has led to disastrous economics and political outcomes throughout the world. There is massive income inequality, billions living in poverty while a handful of people own half the planetary wealth, catastrophic climate change. And the only way to change this is to change our theory of knowledge, to acknowledge our heart's intuitions and feelings as valid sources of knowledge, and that these sources are far superior to our weak intellectual capabilities.